it just my big mouth? Oh, well, when a speaker starts off making excuses from the very beginning, you always are wondering about what he actually did during this time that he was supposed to be getting ready. I have been fascinated I started off with Saul as the king that I was going to work on, and last night talking to Brother John, and my wife has been reminding me of this over and over again, that you're going too deep. So I'm going to end up spending, while all the titles are already in your program, I'm going to spend the whole week on Saul. And so hopefully you'll forgive me just because I dug into stuff so deep that I got to share some of what I found, because maybe it'll help somebody in the room. I love the prayer last night, right? Because we all hear things different. We all walk out with whatever we happen to need. So when I was studying this, and Cindy, my wife, for those who don't know me, she kept saying, "Are you going too deep? Are you going too deep?" And then so we were watching shows on. I got fascinated by trying to figure out what was it really like when they went to war. What was it like to get all those provisions? I had this picture in my head, so we watched a few shows. The Ottoman, I think it was on Netflix. We watched the Castles of England, which had a lot of history in it, and just how brutal man has been to mankind over the years. That's what I walked away with, just shaking my head on what we don't necessarily face, although maybe we're seeing that today, and with Russia and with Ukraine, where they're just bombarding and people's lives. I always get a kick out of the Russians are almost finished. That's great if you're sitting over in the United States, but if you're sitting in Ukraine, it probably doesn't feel too good after your homes are destroyed and everything else. So a lot of looking at even the reading this morning, where God says to, let me just get it up again, chapter 12, which is something that hopefully I will talk a little bit about. I don't know if it's tomorrow, but in Nathan, verse 13 of what Nick read this morning. So David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die." And we'll see in Saul's life, he does the same thing, but it's a different outcome. And I think when you look at how Saul, one of the great strengths of people is they have determination to accomplish something, and one of the greatest weaknesses is when you have determination to keep doing what's wrong instead of making a change. So we'll look a little bit at the history of Saul's family and some of the curiosities that I had that I dug into, may be helpful to some. But this is what God might say to me if he was speaking directly to me. There's in 1 Samuel 16:1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel?" And I highlight that because I want to talk about that for a minute. "Fill your horns with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I provided myself a king among his sons." And then God might say to me, "How long are you going to keep studying Saul, Steve? Because I've rejected him as king," right? So I dug in deep and trying to understand some of the history. I probably could give a lesson on the Judges, on Samuel, on a lot of the things looking back through there. And I actually did make a few exhortations on that. So first introduction, and this is an introduction to Saul and Kish, the family. And again, we don't necessarily know a lot about Kish. I know there's various places he's mentioned. I know John will be talking a little bit about that in one of his classes. But there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel. And I'm sure if Peter was up here, he'd be correcting how I'm saying these words. The son of Zeor, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiel, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And of course, that power there, that word is wealth. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. And there was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So I can always think of Goliath, right? He was a big, mighty man, right? So what do we want to look for? The guy who, if he's going to be in battle for us to be the king, we want to pick the big guy that might be able to defeat everybody else. And so often, what do? We look at the outward appearance instead of the inward, what what's really in that person. And I think that's what the story of Saul and David and someone we'll be talking about this week. And I don't know how the illustrations are coming out. So their home was in, I'm going to step over here. Is that all right for the camera?
You're good.
So anyhow, there was a lot of, this is where Gibeah is, and hopefully some of these pictures I have, I tried to lighten them up this morning because they didn't come out very good last night. So you can just picture, this is a photo I found, of Saul being introduced in a sense, and again, you can see he's a head taller, and while that may not be exactly where he is, and Saul also went home to Gibeah, and that's in 1026. And so Gibeah was their home. So then, of course, I got fascinated with what was their home, any historical significance to it. And so those are some of the things that we'll talk about. But you can see where Gibeah is here and some of the cities around. I have another map that I'll show you. Of course, every time now when I do the daily readings, my favorite thing is to look on the map where a city might be. And so maybe some of you do that as well and study. So, Kish is the tribe of Benjamin, the clan of Matri. I'm not sure exactly how it's the Matri, I'll say. And that's mentioned in chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. It says that Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come together. We'll be talking about this a little bit more when he's made king. And again, 3 times, there's 3 different ceremonies for him making king, 1 private and 2 public ones. And he says he's of the family of Matri was chosen, and then Saul the son of Kish was chosen, but when they sought him, he could not be found. And so Matri is who I'm talking about here in 1021. There is no real history or anything that I can find. There's a lot of people that, and maybe somebody else in study could tell me on a break or lunch. I could not find anything other than there was an assumption potentially of a family, and I'll show you that in a minute on a chart I put up. So in 1 Chronicles 9:35 through 39, these are, again, some of the history of Kish. One of the things I found interesting is that there is 2 Kishes mentioned here, right? And then you've got Kish, Kish begot Saul, and Saul begot Jonathan, and then his family there. So anyhow, so this is, again, just a reminder of the family tree, if you will, and this is something I found. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, you can see it. So there's 2 things we see. There's a disconnect, and that kind of got me digging into wondering why is there a disconnect in the line of Benjamin. And so first, when I found this family tree, I was thinking maybe somebody did dig in, but then again, you start digging in, reading them over again, trying to make my own map. And so ultimately there is, if you look what we read in that opening verse, there is a disconnect right here to the family of Benjamin. So this is the tribe. And then Hupin, this is where they think the tribe was a wife of Hupin. I'm not sure where they get that from. I read a whole bunch of stuff on it, but none of it, it's not biblical, so it doesn't, at least I couldn't find anywhere in the scriptures where it answered it for me. But so anyhow, that was the speculation, that was the family, and then of course, what we just read, there we got Kish, Kish we got Saul. And so that's the family. And again, there's not a lot about Kish. So, things that came up that I was making notes on originally was where were they from, how were they raised, did they go up yearly for the worship service? There's just a lot of things about their history that I was just curious about the Benjamites. So I went all the way back to when Jacob blesses Benjamin. Did he say anything, down through the ages of time? And again, you get into the Judges, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a little bit, because there's an interesting story in the Judges, which I'm sure everybody knows. But it kind of struck me. I was trying to think about would any of this have influenced Saul's life? Would this have influenced Kish? How far away? What was Samuel doing? What was his tour? Where did they go worship? Shiloh, we know, was at one time. Where was the actual center of worship? We know God put his name there. We'll look at that as well. So, setting the stage, the elders of Israel ask for a king. And that's back in 1 Samuel. If you're one who looks up 1 Samuel chapter 8, we're going to look at that. But that's where we meet Saul. So the question to me was Saul an arrogant guy and wanted that job? So there's never been one before, right? And so we know that people chase after the presidency and the governors and, things that we see in our political society and literally around the world. People will kill people over things, and so they really seek out that power that's given to the person who's in that role. And so my first thing was did Saul really want that job? And I don't think so, but we'll look at a couple things over the next several days, and hopefully we can draw some sort of conclusion to that. So I use the New King James Version a lot. If you go to my desk at home, and that's the other thing my wife made me comment, I have notes everywhere. If you go into my office at home, I have a board up there, I have things, and I've got notes everywhere as I've been thinking about how to put this together. And so anyhow, just, some of the notes that I have and that I've taken, were very helpful for me because I don't have as good of a memory as I used to have. And by the way, I know you said you're going to give me 5 minutes. Right? Is that a 5? It looks like an S. Can you fix that before? Anyhow, so I am a little lost on the time it's going to take to do this because it's been a little while since I've given a class. But again, we'll stop wherever it is to make sure that we have it. Again, we can pick up any of it because it all kind of makes it or will come together. So anyhow, so we look at 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 5. I'll step over here. It says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old, and he made his sons judges over Israel." So does anybody remember the last judge and what his sons were like? So there was Eli, right, Hophni and Phinehas. So as we read this, again, you think, was it, and this is always the story of the kings to me. One's good and the son's evil. A real evil son, and then the next king is good. And how does that happen, right? And so I know we're all individuals. I've learned that over my lifetime. So the name of the firstborn was Joel, the name of the second was Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. And I'll show you that. Now Beersheba versus where home Ramah was for Samuel is quite a distance. And I always think, hey, you're far away from dad and the influence of dad, then I'm going to start doing evil things. I don't know, it doesn't really tell us that. But of course, that's where my mind goes right away, maybe because I had a little bit of that in me myself growing up. So they were judges in Beersheba, but the sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So, which is the problem with power, right? Brother Norm Fidel told me years ago, I love playing business every day. So it's something that I've always enjoyed in my life. And he's like, remember, you don't need to be in the lead position, because sometimes the lead position, I always remember my dad telling me a story about his dad, who was very concerned when he went into management. You should be a worker. Don't get involved in that, because things happen to you when you take over and become powerful. So I've heard it my whole life. My dad used to remind me of that as well. So anyhow, but they go and they get into this power position, and what do? They do the wrong thing, right? And I think these are the lessons that we walk away from with this study. Is there's so much. Well, of course, the scriptures are so rich in information and helping us. And the daily readings. I happen to follow the daily reading schedule. I think it's the Robert Roberts one. And again, today's reading was that as well. But to me, it really helps you as best as you can to keep your mind in tune. I'm an early riser, so I do it in the morning. That's how I go about it. All the others of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel Ramah. Ramah was home, and we'll see that a little bit of where Samuel was. And again, these are all located around the same area. And he said to him, look, you're old. So they called him old. Your son's not walking your ways. So again, is there rightfully trying to figure out what is going to happen after he's gone? There's it was a peaceful time during that time, during Samuel's reign against the enemies, as far as I can tell. So again, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So who is the judge at this point? Samuel. Right, by the way, you can answer it. I like an interactive class rather than just standing up here talking. So the judge is Samuel. And one of the things I always think about was, when they asked that, would that have affected him personally? Would he have thought, are they rejecting me I think that would be a natural human thing. Why did they come to me and worry about this, right? So it's, at this point, it says his sons were, I think Samuel must have known what they were. Now, Eli certainly answered for his sons, right? Hey, you never stood up to him and said anything. It doesn't really say much about that here. They're far away. I don't know. Again, how exactly, and again, sometimes we think of the judges being over everything. Sometimes they were judges and affected an area or came to a battle. So, anyhow, so they asked for a king, but this thing displeased Samuel when he said, give us a king to judge us. So, was Samuel personally affected, or was it because of what God would feel? And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people, and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, and that I should not reign over them. So it appears to me that God knows his intent, that maybe it was something he was feeling, potentially. So you can debate that yourself in your own mind, but it sure feels that way by the reading, that Samuel was the first affected, and then again, God steps in. Remember, that's why I get reminded at home, it's not all about me. I think I said that to somebody this morning. When I bumped into their chair, I have to be reminded it's not all about me. So, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So, all during Samuel's reign, there were still other gods. They had not given up those gods, and there's a verse that I don't remember where it is. Maybe I'll show it later in the week. But where, hey, when we followed God, we had all these problems. But when we followed this, I think the queen of something, we didn't have any problems. So people really thought they were doing something. And so what's the funnest stories in the scriptures to me is when God tells them, hey, you take this wood, you cut it up for firewood, you make this thing, this tool you need, and then you go make this God and you think it can do something for you, right? So there's plenty of evidence throughout the scriptures that, and I always wonder, what is that in our day? What are the things that we're missing like that we think do something for us? Whether it's money, it's whatever it happens to be, and I'm sure everybody can answer that for themselves. What exactly is those things for us? So, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them. What is it like to have a king? So God as a king is completely different than man as a king, right? We all know that. We see that in our lives. So this is the kind of the premise with which we'll build this week on, and talk a lot about these things and their life, and Saul and mainly Saul and Kish, and then of course he interacts with David a lot, and those interactions are always, and again, you can take this for however you feel, but I feel like God never gave up on Saul. And again, I'm sure some in here believe maybe he did turn around. And I always think of that about Solomon at the end, some of the verses that we read. The verse that I read in opening, I think, or do I talk about it here? Let me go here for you. So here's Ramah. Here's kind of the area that was of the land during Saul's time, Samuel's time. So here's Beersheba way down here, and here's Ramah. Well, it's probably 30 miles away when you had to walk it or ride it. It certainly was a lot farther than, us jumping in the car and, we're there in a few minutes. So, and again, all that traveling. So that was kind of the distance with which Beersheba was to Ramah. And this is really talking about Samuel's sons and why they were down there. I don't know if there were issues, right? So when you're leading something, there might be a problem in an area. You need to send them down there. And maybe there was corruption there, and they joined in as opposed to stop them, right? I mean, you can think of all kinds of things that happen in our lifetime. So that was his two sons, and again, did that drive the elders to go and ask for a king? So, is there any precedent for a king? Did God ever intend us to have a king? So Moses wrote, if you're one that looks up Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17, and I won't necessarily read all of this, but when you come into the land which the Lord God is giving you to possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Does that sound like what we just read? Right, so there's precedent when Moses wrote that, and did the elders of Israel know this? And that's why they asked? I mean, these are the questions that I kept asking and kept digging in, trying to find. Which again, I got some coaching last night from Brother John saying, sometimes you got to limit your scope and not get off of there. He's laughing up here, but I appreciate those kind of things. I've been hearing from my wife for several months, and of course I didn't listen to her. I just remember Harry Whitaker telling the story of his wife. He'd go ask his wife, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And she'd answer him. He goes, "She doesn't know what she's talking about." And then later on, he goes, "Oh, that was a pretty wise comment." Right? So, you shall surely set a king over you, and the Lord your God chooses one from among your brethren, and you shall set him as king over you. So again, here's precedent back in Deuteronomy for that, right? And neither shall he multiply all the things that we know that happened to the kings. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Of course, no king of Israel ever did that, correct? Not a single one. They all followed this. One of the things that one of the brothers in our meeting, Perry, said, one of his goals in life was to actually handwrite the entire law out, because he thought this was fascinating. So that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book, for the one before the priests and the Levites, right? So write a copy of the law. The law, again, if he was sort of talking like writing from Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? First 5 books. And it kind of fascinated me. I never really thought about that, because one of the things that I learned, right, is if you write it down, it lasts longer. So as I'm reading and I'm studying, I would make notes. That's why I have notes all over the house, trying to understand some of this stuff, and it helped me retain it a little bit longer. And it shall be that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left. And so if we follow that, whether we're a king or not, we're pretty good, correct? This is yes, no, right? So, okay. So this, again, sets the stage for, this was told before. What exactly drove them to ask for a king? Was it the sons not coming up? They were worried about what was going to happen. It was a peaceful time for them. Don't really know. At least I haven't found it. Maybe somebody else can share that with me. So here's where my curiosity began. I've covered some of these, but the tribe of Benjamin, the history, the influence of Saul's upbringing, second judge was Ehud, which was a Benjamite. Given some of the things that happened to the Benjamites, then I was going through and looking at all the judges, and now if you look at my Bible, I've underlined and said which tribe that I can figure out they were from. The Gibeah, the history, and that brought us to Judges 19 through 21. And again, when we read a book, we often, you read it in chronological order. And we're going to look a little bit at Judges 19 through 21. That's the story of the Levite in Gibeah and the concubine story. We'll look a little bit about that. And we'll see what Saul does in his life. That seems very similar. But again, we'll look at the time frame of that. And again, at that time, all the women of Benjamin were destroyed, it says, or killed. So would that have influenced his life? That's what I started looking at. And again, you have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. So it must be in order, right? So Ruth and Judges and all must follow. Obviously not. Most of you know that in this room. So the other thing in studying the history, if you go back to 1 Samuel, did Kish go up for a year to worship? Would Saul have been raised going annually to wherever the Lord's name was? And we know it began at Shiloh. So we'll look at the example of Samuel's family and just briefly talk about how clear that is. And again, I love when you read the stories and you see in all the chaos of life that there's these remnant that are doing the right thing and following, even with evil all around them. So then the ark, where was it? I know there was, and what got me thinking about that, Saul calls it up and says, hey, bring the ark up. And we'll look at that story as well later in the week. And then the timeline of events in 1 Samuel, Saul, David, King, again, how did that all flow? And I really had a heck of a time trying to connect some of the stories together, the battles and all that were there. So, Saul's age, this is the one that first started with. If you go through the Kings, most of the time it'll say, and he was X years old, and he was a king for as long. It doesn't say that about Saul. So, the first one we'll look at is his age. And I don't know if that picture comes out. If you look at, let me step back over here. If you look at the this timeline, and this is what I had to try to lighten up. It's very hard to see, but you'll see 1095 to 1055. This is what at least this person thought that he was king, because we know, we'll look at that in Acts, Saul, whose name was changed to Paul, was a Benjamite, interestingly enough. So in 1 Samuel 13:1, it says, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, then there's a story there, right? But if you read the NIV, it says, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. That's not really from the original manuscript. That was a pure speculation. I don't think it's a bad one, but if you're reading that particular verse, you think, okay, there it is. It's right there. But that's the two different. And again, I have underneath my desk like 3 different Bibles, and I pull it out and I try to read each one of what it says as I'm going through this. I'm sure there's a lot. Maybe you can Google it. So Paul, who was Saul, right? In Acts 13 says, and this took about 450 years. After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, the son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled for 40 years. So, again, that was Paul's writing to them. So this kind of gives us a little bit of time frame. But I would say, to me, it's a little bit unclear. But I would surmise that that's pretty close. It looks like he was probably about 70 years old when he was killed. But there's some speculation that he really only ruled for 20 years, and I'm sure people have looked into this. Everybody's got their opinion. But so 1095 to 1055, we know that there's an overlapping of David, but it's a little bit unclear into where once he dies, then David really starts taking over the kingdom, and then eventually moves through. But so in 9:2 it says, from his head and shoulders upward, he was taller than any people. Now a young person can be taller than. There's taller people than me that are a lot younger than me. So that's initially, but it just shows you that he's a man, right? Tomorrow about this time, 16:15, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. So he was definitely not a child, like some of the kings that came over, right? They were children, and it calls them children. So we know he was a man of some age. So as best of what the NIV says, it's probably somewhere in that time frame. Again, as best as I can. Well, does that matter? It doesn't. What does that matter to us? It doesn't, other than it wasn't clear, and that's what made me look into it. So I thought I would share for anybody who would want. So, how would the city play a role in his life? The city he was raised in. What was it like? Right. So I was raised in Miami, Florida. How did that affect me? I don't know that it affected me at all. I'm not sure. We lived near the beach, but we went there as kids, but never went after that. I'll never forget when Debbie was a baby. We had some relatives come down, and we took them over to Miami Beach, and Debbie's a little baby, and she's touching her feet on the sand, and she kept picking them up. I was like, what is this stuff? And I'm going, well, we never even took her to the beach, right? So here you are in a beach city. Would this have affected Saul's life? Well, certainly, the family that would have been around there, I think, could have influenced his life. And so here's, again, Gibeah, where he was around. And this kind of gives you an idea. These were some of the, and we'll be talking about that throughout the week. These are some of the cities that were part of Saul's life. Whether it was Ziklag, where David went down to for a while, right? So I have those in blue. These were foreign cities. Jabesh Gilead, we'll see that was his first battle. We remember he goes to see it Endor, and I know Brother John will be talking about that. And so these are some of the cities. But again, you see where Ramah is, Gibeah is, and we're going to look at a little bit of Samuel's track that he went on his yearly worship, where he would travel around to these cities. And so again, just can kind of take it in if this helps anybody. This is a map I found, kind of showing where all the tribes were. Not necessarily anything for this, but to kind of give you an idea. And of course, they're surrounded. And what does anybody remember the first city that they came into? We could add this to their trivia. What was the first city that the children of Israel came into and camped at? Gilgal.
right? So that's where they come across the Jordan. We see it, they come in here, and we know, well, it's not showing here, Jericho's there, Ai's there. There's other cities that were around that they first went to, right? So they go to Jericho, the walls fall, and they take them, then they go to Ai, and what happens? Something goes wrong, right? Because somebody took something they shouldn't have, and God's teaching. So, here's some timelines that, I know this is a little bit difficult to see. I tried to light this up as best as well. We looked at this last night. I do have this book with me that has the time and the history that folds out, so if anybody's interested, I can bring it here. But Ehud was, and this is going to mean something here in a few minutes when we look at Judges 19 through 21. Ehud is here. He was a Benjamite. And Judges 19 through 21, and Phineas is mentioned there. We'll talk about that. Ruth was around the time. So right here's Boaz, as best as this is. So sometime in the time of Gideon, and again, I apologize if these, you can see them very good on the screen, but obviously not on this screen. And then Jesse, one of the things that struck me about Jesse, he was around from Samson, through Eli. And so you think about the stories he could have told David, right? And so the influence on his sons, while he was his youngest son, he certainly saw a lot of things, right, that happened during that time in the Judges. And of course, Samuel, Kish, Saul is up here, Samuel here. And again, this is kind of interesting because this is kind of blurred at the time of when Samuel really stopped and Saul took over. Even though he appointed him king, they still looked at Samuel. There's always that transition period. So you can kind of see as best as possible, and I apologize if it's not better. I don't know what this would look like on the screen was the whole thing. It would be huge. So, how much time? 10 minutes. Okay. So we'll look at this, and anything we'll stop whenever. Judges 19 through 21. So it's the last 3 books of Judges, and there's a story in there that affects the tribe of Benjamin. And this is what I was talking about when I was looking back at history, and I came across this. The first thing you want to know is, what's the time frame? Could this have happened just before Saul or Kish were there? Could that have influenced them? So we'll look at this really quickly. You'll see on the map where Gibeah is, Ramah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where David was from. And of course, Gilgal, where they came in first. But Judges 19, and again, if 19 through 21, if you have a chance, I know it was just in the readings not too long ago, so it may be in your mind. There was a certain Levite who went in to the town of Gibeah. I'm going to tell the story a little bit, which belongs to Benjamin, and they turned aside and they went and they lodged there, is the story. And some of you probably remember it. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel. So if we jump around, as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly a certain men from the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat the door. They spoke to the master's house, the old man saying, "Bring out the man that came to our house that we may know him carnally." And what does that remind you of? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So it's sort of Israel's Sodom and Gomorrah. It's at the end of that time frame, and of course that made me start thinking about, okay, so this is Benjamin, this is Gibeah, where Saul was raised, and Kish. So then the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and all the children of Israel were destroyed, 25,100 Benjamites, and then there were 600 hid in the mountains. I didn't go into all that. And then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do since the women of Benjamin have been destroyed?" So first thing I'm thinking is, okay, how did that influence Saul, Kish? So I'm not sure, but it certainly is Israel's Sodom and Gomorrah story of all that. As you think about that, and again, these could be certainly topics of discussion. But so this happens, and then so when did it happen? And of course, God answers. Sometimes it's a little bit hard for me to find, but God typically answers. And if you look in Judges 20, 27, and 28, it said, and Phineas, the children of Israel inquired of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant of God was there in those days, and Phineas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before them in those days. So when was Phineas? Who was Phineas? Phineas was it says it right there, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron. So that happened a long time before Saul, correct? So because it was the end of the Judges, I was automatically thinking, okay, until I discovered what time frame that was, I was thinking this might have been pretty close to Saul and had an influence. What was that like? But this was some 240 years. So here's, and you can't see this very well, here's Phineas, here's time, which is always interesting to me because the Benjamites, women were all destroyed, but Ehud was a Benjamite. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. He was so in all this, what God was doing, Benjamin wasn't completely, that doesn't make everybody bad. There were 600 men who hid, and then they came out, they got them wives. So again, something we're studying, but Ehud, son of Gera, a Benjamite. So he was of the tribe of Benjamin. And so when you look at that story, you realize this was back in the beginning of the time of the Judges. If that helps anyone. So here's another timeline. So here's Ehud, again, who was a judge in Israel at that time. And you can see that, again, Benjamin, and I just wiped out some of it, but you see Ehud there. This is another time frame where they talk about in 1290, Phineas, Aaron's grandson, Judges 19 through 21. So again, it was very, very a long time ago. So would it have influenced Saul? I'm only telling you this because if anybody else wonders like me, I don't think it had any influence necessarily on him, but there's one story in Saul's life that he does that has similar tones to that story. So, the ark. Where was the ark? We know that in Jeremiah, and we'll read this, Jeremiah 7, 11, 12, right? It says, "Has the house which is called by my name become a den of thieves in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, says the Lord. But go now to my place, which was in Shiloh, where I set up my name at first, and see what I did because of the wickedness of the people of Israel." So this was in the time of Eli, and the Philistines would have taken over that. But so again, where he first put his name, and then of course you start to think, where was the worship service? I got an S in front of me. Thank God, that means I got 5 minutes. So perfect, thank you. So where was the ark? And while I won't spend a lot of time on this, this is a map, and again, we can talk about this anytime. When the ark was captured from Shiloh, it's a fun story because God really has fun with the Philistines here, right? So it moves, they put it in the temple, and the Dagon, the god, I think, falls on his face, and eventually it breaks all, they set him back up. And then God is too brutal to their God. It's just like, wake up, that's for us, right? Wake up on those things. So it takes a journey, and then it would have ended up in Kiriath around the time of Saul, Kish, which is where the ark was. And again, we won't spend a lot of time looking at that, but that's sort of the pathway that it took. And you remember, I just found this photo of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, falls and his hands break off. And to me, I always love to read those stories because we know God doesn't need us. There's a story, and we won't go into it in tomorrow or this week, I don't think, but where God, the Philistines were gathering up against Samuel. They're in this place worshiping, and God thunders and lightning so loud that it confuses them, right? And it chases the army off. God doesn't necessarily, as we know, when they came into the land, God did a lot of the work without them. So, tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about Saul's knowledge of God. Did he have any? What are the indications? Do we know about his family worship? I think God teaches Saul his ways, and we'll see that tomorrow. And then did God put Saul in a position to succeed as king? And the answer I can tell you right now is yes, but we'll look at the scriptures that he had every chance to succeed. With that, thank you. 45 minutes went fast. Too short? Okay. Just check. Thank you.